So I just want to say a little bit about what I mean by win-win, then convey the idea, I hope, that there are patterns in the problems, the situations that we all have to face, show some patterns to potential solutions, and then just present a couple of situations from 2 villages around the country that we might discuss. So moving on. So first of all, what do I mean by win-win? Well, I think we're more conventionally aware of number 3, which is the win-lose, which often arises from a majority vote, and as we know, that can sometimes lead to situations where people don't really care what happens to them themselves, provided that the other lot lose, and then you often get a win-lose. So trying to move further up the scale, number 2 is my definition of a compromise, where both parties win something, but they also lose something significant. And so it's only if we can avoid all those possibilities, 2, 3, and 4, that we're going to get to have a chance of getting to number 1. And one prerequisite for that, which Simon and I discussed, was at least at the start, that you declare that you won't accept a compromise. Otherwise, it's too easy to go for number 2. So that's what I'm talking about. On the patterns, here are 2 stories. Here's the first of 2 stories, and I know that Liz knows this one. Here are 2 sisters who want the same orange. The compromise solution would be to cut it in half, maybe, but actually, both their needs can be fulfilled entirely, because one wants to drink juice, and then the other, as you can see, wants the peel. And that's a story that was told first by an American woman called Mary Parker Follett, who was born back in the 19th century. It was her who coined the term win-win. And curiously, that same pattern reappeared in the Camp David negotiations, where just as 2 sisters claimed the same orange, so Israel and Egypt both claimed the Sinai, but actually they, as with the sisters, they had different needs. Sovereignty in the one case, security in the other. So again, as with the orange, it was possible to entirely fulfill the essential needs of both parties. So the Sinai was given to Egypt, it got sovereignty, but it was demilitarized, so Israel got security. I'm now going to whiz through five of such patterns. There are lots of different ways of cutting the cake, but these are the way it came to me. Again, I'm trying to convey an impression, so don't worry about taking it all in. And I'll try not to read the slides, which is a terrible thing to do, and try to give you a bit of time to read them. So I'm giving 2 examples of each of these patterns. So when groups have become polarized, it's an essential prerequisite to help them find common ground with each other. There are 2 aspects to that, and the first aspect is that everyone taking part in a discussion to bring the groups together realizes we are all human. So there's an example of 2 people connecting curiously over their health. The second aspect of common ground is to help people to realize that however different they are, they live in the same world. So once people have found common ground with each other, then they can go on to looking for these win-win solutions. So here's the first pattern, where the important thing in some situations is to take your initial question and find a better one. And better means both deeper, as it says there, and a question where it's much easier for people to find a shared win-win solution. That's a very simple example. Here's a more complex one. Now I can't see the chat in this screen sharing, so if I'm going too fast or something, give me a wave, because I can see most of your pictures. So that's one pattern, evolving a deeper question. Here's another one. Some of you may know the pin diagram. It comes from mediation, where what people often initially do is strike a position, stake it out. And that's particularly true if two groups have become polarized. And they are like the tops of the two branches of the letter Y, a long way apart. But if you can help them go vertically downwards into their interests and even more deeply into their needs, you are proceeding down the letter Y, and you are finding the point at which the two branches join and become one. And as it says, that's true, I think, of Camp David. Second example of that, more complex. A particular method, convergent facilitation, that helps you find that joining point in the letter Y. And I'd like to point particularly to that quote at the bottom of the slide. So there we are, moving from position status at the top of the letter Y down to where everybody has become a shared solver of problems. I think it's really important. Next pattern is where it's not the question that evolves, it's the solution. So Jam and Justice is a project in Manchester, and they took what you might call a single text approach, where they had a single idea, single solution, which they modified. So there's their initial solution, and through discussion, that solution became more and more sophisticated until finally it was the sixth proposal that was agreed by everybody. And there's a point there that I think is really important, which is that we tend to think that the vote is the end of the process. Oh yes, we've had a vote, this was the result, that's the end of it. And actually, a vote is a rather crude, indication of how people are feeling, and it often should not, as in this case, be the end point. It should be a midpoint or the starting point. Here's the second example of allowing the solution to evolve. It's one I was involved with. It uses a method that I helped to develop. And whereas the previous one was used a single text that evolved, this was a different approach where we started out with 6 options. As you can see from A and F, they were a long way apart to start with. But through the incentive that preference voting gives for people who think they disagree to cooperate, and I can say more about that, those options, like the others, evolved, and some of them merged. And so initially, the first 3 options, A, B, and C, merged, then E and F merged, and then finally there was those 2 groupings merged. And so the final outcome there was a result that drew on at least 5 of those original 6 options. Here, I think this is the last of the patterns. So quite often there are apparent contradictions that make 2 groups' positions incompatible, but they are indeed quite often apparent, and over time, with practice, you can spot that false contradiction and therefore resolve the issue. And there's a fairly straightforward example. And here's the a more complex, I think, second example. What is interesting about those 2 examples of spotting false contradictions is that both accounts that I read had one thing in common, which is that when somebody proposed what turned out to be the resolution of the false contradiction, there was a deep and long silence, and it was a recognition that that win-win solution had indeed been found. So just to remind you, those are the patterns that we've just gone through. I did indeed whiz through them, and the first one is obviously different because it's helping people to connect in order to move on to the subsequent issue of looking for a solution that is win-win. 2 examples of each one. So I'm now going to give a couple of examples of parish council issues, and we can discuss those, and I'm sure you will have issues of your own that we can also discuss. Here's a fairly simple one. Each February I go to an event called Not Westminster, very good local government event in Huddersfield, and this year I met Andy Nash, who is the chair of the parish council in Bradwell in the Peak District. Quite a straightforward issue, and that story goes back to what I was saying about voting, which is that I think it'd be very easy to see that village meeting as the end of the story, but in the way that I tend to think about it, it's an indication of opinion and the source of information which can be used to try and find a solution that's win-win. We can come back to that. The next one is rather more heated and featured a bypass, always a course of contention. So slide number 1 is the warm-up act for slide number 2. So that's what happens when serious polarization takes place. And I think that point about the middle ground being squeezed out is particularly interesting. So just to remind you, we've had a look at these 5 patterns and these 2 situations. In a moment, I'll end the screen share and I will paste those into the chat just as a reminder. But that's, I hope, given us something to talk about, and I have managed to whiz through that probably too quickly. So there's plenty of time to talk. Just to remind you, we're going to finish at, by 6. Definitely going to finish by 6 o'clock. Let me put that.